Ayurveda and the paradigm of health. And specifically, he has asked me to talk about the continuity of Sankhya metaphysics across the traditions of yoga and Ayurveda, what this continuity might mean for our understanding of how Hindu traditions approach the issues of consciousness, self, and embodiment, and what this in turn is going to mean for the Ayurvedic understanding of healing and what it means to be healed. And that's basically, I'm going to honor his request. I'm going to dive right into exactly all that. I'm going to switch over to a presentation screen right now. Is that showing, Denio?
Not yet.
Not yet. Let's figure out if I've got this figured out. Okay. I think I need to give myself access here. Apologies, should have tried this earlier. That's a yes. Okay. Okay. There we go. How's that working?
Now it's showing.
Fabulous. Okay, wonderful. So we're going to talk about the pursuit of true understanding and how it plays into the idea of healers and healing in Ayurvedic medicine. Danilo mentioned my recent book, and you can see the image of the cover right there on the screen there if you're interested. I'd encourage everyone to wait until the sale comes in or the paperback if I'm lucky enough. The price is a standard academic price, so to be avoided perhaps. Now, as I move forward, I'm going to try and address things in a series of an orderly series. First, I'm going to talk about the kind of Sankhya that appears in early Ayurveda. This is an early kind of Sankhya, and I need to distinguish this kind of Sankhya from other iterations that we find within the historical and textual record. This early sort of Sankhya that we find within Ayurveda and throughout many other sources, including, we can say, some later Upanishads and the Mahabharata especially. These early forms, they pose a significant difference from the kind of Sankhya that we tend to think of as classical today. These differences are critical when it comes to understanding the Ayurvedic worldview in general, but more to the point, they help us to process the Ayurvedic understanding of who a person or a patient is, and therefore what his or her treatment might entail. Persons and patients, as we will see, are more than their bodies, and they're more than bare consciousness in the Ayurvedic system. They have a worldly character in Ayurvedic theory and practice, in the sense that they merge with and they fill the horizons of their experience in manners that I think are quite significant for thinking through both historical and contemporary issues. I've come to call the Ayurvedic worldview a person-based worldview based on my research, and this is undoubtedly due to the influence of early Sankhya and yoga. Speaking of course, Sankhya and yoga in Ayurveda are inseparably intertwined, as they often are throughout pre-classical Hindu traditions. We can think of them as operating as like theory to method, or as paradigm to technical apparatus, or maybe we could do a more classic framing and say they're like metaphysics to physics. I don't think either of these comparisons really works to describe accurately the relationship between Sankhya and yoga, but nevertheless, they have this kind of complementarity. And I think it's really important, therefore, to talk about the role that yoga plays within Ayurveda's worldview, in particular as it relates to Ayurvedic etiology, which means its theory of how diseases come about, and its therapeutics, its methods for responding to disease. Now, normally when we think of Ayurveda, we think of diets and doshas. This has an effect that's unfortunate of limiting our thinking to bodies and food, and specifically to the kinds of internal medicine that this aspect of Ayurveda addresses. But it has to be noted that Ayurveda's approach to health holds fast to this understanding that every body has its place and its contexts, and every interiority has a direct link to its exteriors. In forging an approach to health that is simultaneously bodily, mental, and spiritual, Ayurveda comes to include the total horizons and the contours and contexts, including those stemming from a person's karmic record within the rubric of our experiencing selves. This is all what it means to be a patient. And so the early physicians saw their medicine as a cure even for such worldly diseases as social and political discord or environmental catastrophes. So it seems inevitable ultimately that we come to see that Ayurveda is not just interested in healing individual patients, it's equally interested in healing the world. And that these are really one and the same exercise. This possibility, I think, of healing not only the bodily ills of the patient, but also their world ultimately comes down to, according to the early sources, the ability to know the world as eminent physicians claim to. And that's to say, by the light of their satya buddhis, their true understanding or true awareness, as I'll sometimes say. And this satya buddhi actively perceives reality with a pure mind and undistorted conscious awareness. So eventually we'll turn our thoughts to Ayurveda's claim about this satya buddhi and what it could possibly mean for the work of healing. To give a really quick preview of what these sources say is the nature of true understanding, I'll simply point out that there is a notion that to be healed, according to Ayurveda, is to bring about a harmonious balance or conjunction. And the Sanskrit term here is samayoga. Samayoga actively supports the underlying identity of persons and world. It in turn means that if we act in a mode of samayoga, then we act in a manner that fulfills in a manner that has a full awareness, let me say, that all those other beings that we encounter in our world are ultimately part of ourselves, or rather our capital S self, as we might say. When our actions fail to reflect and honor that understanding, then we tend to produce conditions for both our own selves and the world's disease. But when our actions do honor that understanding, then we begin to produce the conditions for propagation of healthy states that leads all the way to the possibility of moksha. So with that said, we can go ahead and jump in. I'm going to start by saying something about Sankhya Yoga's significance, generally speaking. And this is going to take me to the first emergence of the Sankhya Yoga metaphysical hierarchy in the Katha Upanishad. Now, this starts the ball rolling for what will eventually become, as Indologist Jean Filiazat said, Sankhya becomes the common baggage of Indian thought. And he means this in a broad sense. This is to be true not only in the domains of philosophy or religion. Sankhya worked its way into politics, into medicine, into astronomy, cuisine, economics, law, drama, architecture, even theories of history rely deeply on the notions that we find in Sankhya metaphysics. It stands from our perspective today as a way of thinking that had a broadly paradigmatic, epistemic impact. I almost think of it as being akin to gravity in culture at this time. So a widespread and unassailably incontrovertible kind of presence in society. Now, yoga obviously had a similarly wide impact that matched its complementary nature. Yoga was not just a practical method for attaining moksha, it worked alongside Sankhya and other elements of Hindu tradition to afford a general theory of change, a kind of physics of transformation of all sorts. Ayurveda gives us an excellent opportunity to see this dimension of yoga in action, which we risk missing if we treat yoga as merely a matter of postures, meditations, or other means of accessing higher states of consciousness. So let me take a second to sort of consider what's going on in this Katha Upanishad, where we see this emergence of the first iteration of what we'll call early Sankhya that leads towards what we call classical Sankhya. Now, this emergence in the Katha Upanishad of early Sankhya appears in tandem with the emergence of the concepts of samsara and yoga in the textual record for the very first time. There we find the text that you see on the screen, this novel hierarchy, which also kind of serves as a roadmap of a metaphysical sort that sketches links between the senses and their objects, the mind and the intellect, the immense self known as the Mahan Atman, the unmanifest known as the Avyakta, and then finally the Purusha. The Purusha is qualified as being without beginning or end, as the all-pervading self, and therefore synonymous with the idea of the Atman, and therefore Brahman. It's the light that all things reflect, and so on. There's a lot of poetic language, usually solar in orientation, that sort of describes what this Purusha is that we're trying to realize. Yoga is introduced as the attending method that leads to this realization. And the focus of that yoga is, as we know, on sensory mastery. These are all signs that the landscape, that the history of our approach to the problems of suffering and Indian traditions is beginning to shift. And it's heralding a new way of thinking about the problem of suffering generally that is simultaneously intellectual and practical. As further iterations of Sankhya appear in the historical record, the metaphysics, they complexify the number of constituent elements included in the hierarchy, which gradually become known as tattvas. These numbers grow, but it's clear that this is a transition in flux, or tradition in flux in its early days. The vocabulary is frequently shifting, and the complementary yoga method is also differing across these sources. But nevertheless, among the earliest Sankhyas, there seems to be some basic points of agreement that are worth highlighting. The first is that the earliest Sankhyans followed the established monistic patterns of Upanishadic and Vedantic thought. The term Purusha, as I mentioned earlier, which is identified as both the totality of existence and more specifically as specially aligned with consciousness. This term could be used interchangeably with the terms Atman and Brahman, and it was styled as both the field of our existence and the knower, so the kshetra and the kshetrajna. Consciousness is ultimately singular in this model, and it's cosmic in scope. It's the creative source and the final destiny of phenomenal existence, which is to say all those elements of the Sankhya hierarchy, whatever form that hierarchy takes. Let me take a moment just to emphasize what this signifies. In early Sankhya, we as human persons and the world of our experience, they come from the same thing. There's no ultimate separation between the creative foundations of ourselves and the world. But it must be added that the Purusha is ultimately neither touched nor affected by what it creates. It's absolutely free. It's the all-pervading witness. It's immanent and transcendent simultaneously. And in this way, it is beyond suffering. Consequently, the moment of liberation that earliest Sankhya describes is not one of abandoning the world, but rather of abandoning the limited, dualistic, and suffering-prone modality of existence that we call samsara. And it's also a moment of liberating ourselves to unite ourselves with the creative source called the Purusha. Now, for the majority of Sankhyans, this liberating moment occurs through a reconfiguration of the way that consciousness relates to the world of its experience, which gets identified with the terms loka, prakriti, or pradhana pretty interchangeably in these early phases. This entails, among other things, the yogic mastery of the sense powers, such that they are, quote unquote, tamed in the presence of the karmic sources of desire and aversion that consciousness encounters. We could say then that liberation is a matter of mastering our typical reactivity to the world so that conscious awareness can develop the transpersonal, cosmic, and worldly perspective that transcends the samsaric cycle. Now, with that in mind, I want to take a moment to appreciate one version of an early metaphysical Sankhya hierarchy that was produced by the Ayurvedic tradition. I'm letting Ayurveda stand as representative of these early Sankhya hierarchies for some reasons that I'll try to suggest later. The tattvas in this iteration, or dhatus as they're called in Ayurveda, they're 24 in number rather than the classical iteration of 25. This list includes the mind, 10 indriyas or powers, the 5 sensory and 5 motor powers, and then the 5 objects of sense. And here when we say the objects of sense, we don't mean specific objects, we mean sight as the object of seeing, sounds as the object of hearing, and so on. This group of 16 is collectively known as the transformations of nature, or prakriti. Vikara is the Sanskrit term there, and it stands as a kind of development that folds out of this 8-fold prakriti, which you can see on the left-hand side of your screen. This consists of the 5 elements. Some argue that this is purely in their subtle form, but that would be a bit early, I think, for this tradition. These are the Mahabhutas: space, wind, fire, water, and earth. Pairing with these are the ego, known as the ahankara, the intellect, which gets 2 different terms, the mahan or the buddhi, and the unmanifest avyakta, which is often taken as synonymous with consciousness, and so it is interchangeable with the term Purusha, as well as the Atman and Kshetrajna. However, the term Purusha in Ayurveda is more properly applied to the whole mass of these 24 constituents. The term in the Sanskrit is a Rashi Purusha, a heap Purusha, and these 24 elements are the heap that makes up the totality of the Purusha. So the Purusha is both consciousness and the totality of everything that unfolds from consciousness. Now, this is the early Sankhyan view. When we compare this to what's going on in classical Sankhya, there is a very clear difference, right? Classical Samkhya, which was most famously affiliated with the philosopher known as Ishvara Krishna, it took the monistic stance that we found so common in the early Sankhyas and turned it on its head. His Purusha is more strongly defined as consciousness to the exclusion of anything else. Hence, the Purusha, in his view, is not actively the creative source of the world. The number of ultimate existences, not one, but two. There's no final cosmic unity of consciousness in the mode of Atman or Brahman. There's only duality. In this system, Prakriti includes both the world elemental and sensible materiality and its psychological dimensions. The mind, the sense of ego self, the basic sense of awareness and understanding and agency, all that stuff is Prakriti. The eightfold Prakriti and the 16 Vikartas you see here, they all just get folded into Prakriti to the exclusion of Purusha. So they are fundamentally not our true selves. They're fundamentally not our consciousness. The earlier Samkhyas in the classical view have misunderstood this final separation because Prakriti's effect on consciousness is so utterly bedazzling that the Purusha, so long as it is not liberated, cannot distinguish itself between itself and the phenomenal world. Now, Ishvara Krishna further broke from early Samkhya to propose that there are an infinite number of potential Purushas, all of which the world serves unconsciously toward the end of bringing about the realization of the difference between itself and the Purusha. Now, the text uses several metaphors to describe this. It says that Prakriti is like a dancer that produces an aesthetic experience for an audience. It's like milk that feeds a growing calf, or like a blind man who carries a lame man to his destination. When the world's work is done, according to the classical Sankhyans, and the Purusha has the dawning realization of its difference from Prakriti, then the Purusha is liberated. And this liberation, which most fully sort of reaches fruition when the body dies, leads to a situation in which Purusha retreats, and so does Prakriti, both moving to their separate corners. The world enters into a state of unmanifestation. It ends its show, and consciousness retreats to a state of contented isolation, pure contentless consciousness, never to make contact with the world again. This really radically reformulated Samkhya when we compare to what happened in the earliest Sankhyas. And the yogas that were developed in response to it, of course, most famously, the Patanjali Yoga Shastra. These were highly influential texts, as I'm sure we all know, but they were not uncontroversial. Their success in re-injecting the possibility of dualism back into the cosmological debate brought up questions whose answers could have critical implications for the fundamental life view of Hindu society. To give you a sense of what I mean here, I want to take a minute to appreciate the dualistic Sankhya position that the world exists specifically and solely for the Purusha. While the world has no necessary for itself, nor should any reciprocation or responsibility, compelled or voluntary, be expected from or required of a Purusha. Such a view lends itself easily to justifying a belief that no particular interaction between the person and the world can ultimately be beneficial. So for instance, Ishvara Krishna tells us that one who knows the Purusha has, quote, grasped that things like Dharma are not actually causes of liberation, end quote. This means that any worldly action, like those required of politics and governance, or the practice of charity and compassion, or the pursuit of social welfare, all this could be seen as pointless, especially if it's all Prakriti, if it's all just a show for the sake of the Purusha. Now, we'd have to say the same is true in the end for medicine, because medicine, after all, is a worldly pursuit that relies on the use of worldly stuff. And so that worldly stuff in the classical view only has an opportunity to address other worldly stuff. The entire medical endeavor would be a wasted energy in this case, potentially. It'd be Prakriti acting on Prakriti, which amounts ultimately to kind of like a shuffling of deck chairs on the body Titanic. So the kind of Sankhya, to get to my broader point in bringing these issues up, the kind of Sankhya matters. And Ayurveda's monistic Sankhya is one that I think can be considered broadly paradigmatic of all those earlier Sankhyas I alluded to earlier, largely due to its thorough thinking through of what Sankhya and yoga mean for our activity in the world. And additionally, because much of what is contained in Ayurveda reappears In other early Sankhya sources, here I'm pointing to various Upanishads, sections of the Mahabharata, and the like. Generally speaking, when we look at the kind of early Sankhya that we find in early Ayurveda, I think we see a tradition that really seems to get what early monistic non-dual Sankhya is all about. And I'm going to try and convince you of that as we move forward today. To really appreciate this, we need to get a sense of the general way that Ayurveda is supposed to work. Ayurveda, as I mentioned earlier, is famously concerned with our diet. The foods that we eat, they form the critical basis for the transformation of the elemental material stuff that the world produces and transforms into the tissues and the fluids of our bodies. In the process of this transformation, certain maladies can arise that can be exacerbated or cured through medicines, therapeutic procedures, and dietary changes. This, however, is only part of how Ayurveda thinks about the idea of diet. Diet here refers not just to things we taste with our mouths, it also includes the sounds that we hear with our ears, the sights that we see with our eyes, even the thoughts that we chew on in our minds. All thought and perception is a matter of diet in Ayurveda. Both the sensible world and our powers of sensation and perception derive from characteristics inherent in the 5 elements that I mentioned earlier. Space is the source of both sounds and of our power of hearing. Fire is the source of visibility and the power of seeing. Water is the source of flavors and the power of taste, and so on and so forth. The habitual ways we use our powers of sense and thought, which is to say the habitual way that we engage with the elements, this forms the basis of our experiencing existence. It's the way that our conscious self enjoys and eats the world around us. Now, all diet considered in this broad way is a matter of yoga. When we look at the usage of the term yoga and related terms in the Ayurvedic works, it's quickly evident that its sense of yoga covers a really wide ground. If we were to try to capture the scope of this wide ground, we might say that yoga refers to the way that things, quote unquote, join together and bring about change. This joining is just another way of thinking about our eating and our enjoying of the things of the world. So our diet, again, in this broad sense, is in fact a yoga diet that is rooted in perceptual habitual action. When our sense powers and thoughts join with the world in harmonious fashions, we call this sama yoga. It's the even yoga that promotes healthy states. When we join with the world in a disharmonious fashion, either because we overindulge in a practice of ati yoga, underindulge in a practice of ayoga, or hina yoga, as sometimes is said, or indulge in completely wrong stuff, which is known as nitya yoga, then we promote elemental imbalances that bring disease in the form of either a buildup of waste products in our body called doshas, or, and often simultaneously, some form of distortion of the mind's functioning and the accuracy of its awareness. Both of these are highly significant, of course, to health. Now, I think it's really important to note that the physicians, they considered perception to be a joining activity in a literal sense. According to Ayurveda, perceptual events occur through the conjunction, the samyoga, of a sense object, a sense power, the mind, and consciousness. Sense powers at this time were believed to operate by direct contact and through an outward reaching action. This is the Pratyakari model of perception. In the same way that we can reach out and directly touch the table or the screen in front of us to get a tactile sensation, our power of sight reaches out into the horizons to touch a tree, a face, or a screen. Hearing reaches out into the horizons to directly touch sounds and so forth. Now, the mind's role in this process is to direct the use of the sense powers to specific objects, and additionally to make a whole series of determinations about those things that we eat with our senses and how we should respond to them. But the mind is also the record keeper of past acts, of karma. And so the mind develops a kind of habituated quality that significantly impacts the way that it and the senses in turn function. Ayurveda follows Samkhya to describe the mind as existing in 3 basic states. Ideally, the mind is in a state of total clarity and purity. This is known as sattva. Such a mind is dominated by states like tranquility, compassion, care, a lack of negligence. And so it guides the senses with that same care and precision, much, if we want to draw on the previous metaphors that have been used in these traditions, like a calm and vigilant chariot driver leads his tamed horses. Less ideal are states of agitation or turbidity, which I'm using to translate the word rajas, or cloudy, inactive darkness, which I'm using to refer to the state known as tamas. These different states are associated with affective states like envy, anger, greed, laziness, and so on. They in turn lead the mind and senses in a way that ends up causing trouble, friction, and imbalances between the person and their environing world. The bigger issue here underlying is that a mind that isn't clear can present the world in a distorted fashion, leading to habitual errors in perception and action, creating a feedback loop that basically wrecks the person's diet and continuously leads towards illness. Now, we're not done talking about perception just yet, because the outcome of the conjunction of a sense power, a sense object, the mind, and the conscious self is the arising of an event of awareness, in which understanding is sort of immediately present as well. This is how I'm thinking about the term buddhi. A buddhi in Ayurveda is the totality of the perceptual experience occurring as a moment of awareness, manifesting as an experienceable world, and also the immediacy of our apperceptive understanding of it. This is another reason why Ayurveda resists identifying the patient with the body alone, because this understanding awareness that emerges from our perceptual yoga has the quality of being outwardly spatial in nature. The buddhi, which expresses the sum of our sensual and mental existence, represents the network of interrelations that the physician is attempting to regulate and harmonize, because this is the access that he has to our own agency when it comes to producing states of health and disease. Now, when the texts talk about the buddhi, they refer to it as either big or small, as bright or dim, as true or faulty. We find metaphors of lanterns, of rising suns, or well-fed fires that are used throughout the period, not just in Ayurvedic works, but in works like the Mahabharata, to describe the buddhi as a basically luminous faculty. The physician's hope in all this is for the buddhi's light to grow and improve. For by this, a patient will naturally tend toward habits that promote better health. Consequently, the regulation of the perceptual event, of all perceptual events, and thereby the quality of the mind and the space of understanding awareness that we inhabit, this is critical to the physician's art. There's a kind of bottom-up logic at work here. A good dietary yoga involves an even and balanced enjoyment of the sensible world. It follows the rhythms of the seasons. It considers the features of our locality. It takes an appropriate measure from the world. It's not driven by the immediacy of sensory hunger or reactive desire. And as a result, when it's continued to be used, this good dietary yoga, the mind becomes clear and composed. The world is seen more clearly, more of it is seen as well, and the light of understanding ultimately follows suit, becomes more and more true, leading ultimately to the realization of the Satya Buddhi. By contrast, a bad dietary yoga follows a pattern of indulgence. It takes no consideration for the season and the local soils. It chases momentary delights in the shiny, the flavorful, or the loud. It has an addiction to its iPhone, we could say. With no restraint, the mind grows agitated and cloudy, desirous, greedy, envious, and angry. The light of awareness doesn't reach as far or shine as clearly. And such a person is therefore prone to perpetuate and compound errors in judgment and action that will naturally produce states of ill health. From the top down, if we look at it from the opposite side, when a mind lacks clarity, then the sensible world no longer manifests as it should. This is known in Ayurveda as an event of faulty awareness. And I think I had that term on the previous slide there. This is prajna paradha. It's a term that means faulty awareness. We want to translate in one way, but it also represents this ability for our understanding of the world to miss the mark. And that's what aparadha really sort of signifies here. It tells us that each arising event of awareness and the discernment of what things are and how one should respond to them, this can go really fatally awry. An ongoing faulty awareness, according to the commentarial tradition, it produces a knowledge that isn't really knowledge. Rather, it develops an uneven discernment of vishama vijnana, an improper knowledge of mithya jnana, and it leads to an uneven conduct, Vishama Pravartana. And as a result, it leads to the disarticulation of person and world. For this reason, faulty awareness is of a fundamental concern for physical and spiritual well-being, because it means that our suffering is rooted primarily in an ignorance that can go totally unnoticed. It's precisely the kind of fault that could easily compound across generations of misdeeds, with a potential to disrupt and disarticulate whole systems of relations that are necessarily involved in health. I'll come back to this idea later. But for now, we can say that faulty awareness from the Ayurvedic standpoint is arguably the true motor of the samsaric cosmos. Now, the physician's ultimate hope is to bring about a sort of perfection of this yoga diet in his patients, to the point that their understanding of reality, their awareness of it, is without fault, and that the harmony of good health will then truly prevail between the person and the world. On this count, Ayurveda turns in its earliest works to the subject of the Satyabhuti, the true understanding, an undistorted awareness, as we may also think about it. And this represents both the height and the foundation of good health in a Samkhya yogic system of medicine. I want to just point to a couple of different quotes from the Charaka Samhita, one of the foundational works of Ayurveda, that speaks most clearly on the idea of the Satyabhuti, just to get a sense of what they're pointing us towards when they use this term. So the first quote here says that when the mind is clear, the true understanding, the Satyabhuti, arises, thanks to which one cuts through the darkness of great delusion. It's some obvious stuff in this quote, right? We've got clarity and knowledge in an absence of wrong knowledge as a fundamental value in the system. The thing that we can add when we look at this quote is that the word delusion here is translating moha, which was used interchangeably in some early Samkhyas for the more standard guna term tamas. So we're definitely moving towards a Sankhyan realization here, and we're doing so specifically in an early Sankhyan idiom. The next quote tells us that, quote, as soon as true understanding arises, there is the expansive insight, quote, I am not this is not mine, end quote. We're getting clearly more spiritual in orientation here. This insight is expansive, which is a nice callback to the spatial qualities of the Buddha's understanding awareness. And the precise insight that we see here, a disavowal of mindness, is potentially a historical borrowing from Buddhism, but it could simply have reflected at this time a more universally agreeable sentiment, as we do see this same sort of phrase appear in many places, like the Mahabharata especially. Now, the final quote on the board here says that, quote, true understanding arises when one sees equally the self in the world and the world in the self. Seeing the self in the entire world, one becomes the self alone, the sole author of pleasure and pain. This is actually the quote that really sort of sparked all of my investigations into Ayurveda. It really grabbed me for some reason. And what we see here is a kind of full-throated mysticism that's clearly indebted to the traditions of Hindu asceticism. It directly echoes, in fact, sort of cites a claim that appears in the Upanishads and in the mouths of many teachers in the Mahabharata as well. True understanding here is directly linked to the awareness of the self, which is, as the quote suggests, not just within the body, but spread throughout the totality of the world as a unitary, extensive, and creatively powerful force. Now, this claim that the self's total creative authorship is what we're aiming for, this expresses, I think, pretty clearly the early Sankhya yogic leanings of the physicians. And moreover, it hints at some of the more supernatural consequences that true understanding was believed to afford for these early physicians. I want to sort of touch base with these more supernatural consequences that true understanding is meant to afford. And to do so, I'm going to take a look at a couple more quotes. These all come from the Charaka Samhita, and they tell us that a mind that sees with the brilliance of the self and with a true buddhi, it is entering into a state that is called composed. The Sanskrit term here is samadhana. Here, the word composed refers to the fact that the mind has turned its attention to the inspection of the true object, as the text says, which is to say the self. This composed manner of seeing is explained in the Charaka Samhita at the end of a long discussion of the nature of the Purusha and the processes of perception. And in the midst of this preceding discussion, the question gets raised as to why a person who is by nature unitary and the same as the universal and omnipresent self of all. Why this omnipresent universal self does not perceive things that are distant or obscured by things like mountains? The answer given, it rests upon the inherent expansiveness of the self. And so we have this first quote here: the self is by nature great and it spreads everywhere. And due to the composition of the mind, the self sees what is concealed. One should know that the self enters every womb, even as it abides in a single womb, even as it gets connected to a mind by karma. Now, all perception, as I mentioned earlier, requires some form of contact. Normal perception relies on the fourfold contact of sense power, sense object, mind, and the conscious Atman. But when the mind ceases to direct the sense powers towards specific sense objects and becomes purified, composing itself upon the self, what then is perceived? In effect, the universality of the Atman means that the perceptual power of the Atman is limitless. It is always in universal contact. Hence, things far away or invisible are already contiguous with the Atman. And this is all that is required for perception, at least for one who is capable of seeing the self's full extent. Deepening what this means to the understanding of one who sees the universal presence of the self, nothing is concealed. And this includes, as this passage and others imply, seeing the ways that an embodied transmigrating self has been impacted by karma. The need for this makes good medical sense, after all. Karma is used here to refer to the extended record of a person's yoga diet, their habits and their actions, not just in this lifetime, but spreading across multiple lifetimes. One has to be able to understand the genuine causes of a patient's suffering should healing be a genuine possibility. True understanding in this sense then is a sort of panacea. It's the one thing that has the potential to cure all ills. And so it really has a supernatural capacity to it. Now, physicians aren't just understanding the health of their parents in this thick yoga-based dietary idiom, they are applying it to their own practice. That is to say, what is true for the patient is equally true for the physician. The physician must, above all others, practice the yoga of a good sensory diet, of a clarified mind and expanded awareness in order to appropriately treat the disease of their patients. And so they too are exhorted to develop the capacity to see the self by first learning how to discern it in others, precisely so that their knowledge of a patient's condition will become clear. As one physician says to all prospective physicians, quote, "Listen, O physician, the self's power to know is tremendous. When the sense powers are composed and the unsteady mind is concentrated, then knowledge is everywhere unimpeded. One sees all things." When I hear this, I'm immediately reminded of the great sensitivity and insight of some pulse reading Vaidyas in the modern Ayurvedic world. And of course, many statements that we have from the history of Ayurvedic physicians' claims, as they say that they continue this superhuman perceptual practice of stretching their powers to their limits in order to keep up in competition with modern imaging technologies. Such is the proposed power of a true understanding that can only come from a composed, restrained set of sense powers and a clear state of mind. The balance of the doshas and the like that we predominantly associate with Ayurveda, this is all rather downstream from this more basic cause of health. We can suggest then that the very nature of healing in Ayurveda rests upon the search for true understanding. We can say that true understanding is healing, that true understanding is health. Now, by way of wrapping things up, and as a way of further demonstrating how true understanding pushes us beyond the mere identification of ourselves with bodies or consciousness and toward a broader identification with the world of our experience, I'd like to turn briefly to a section in the Charaka Samhita that deals with the problem of epidemic disease. All disease, as we have seen, is thought to originate from the way that conscious persons and environing worlds continuously merge and flow through acts of yoga. Cases of individual illness can therefore be explained as a result of individual karmic habits, the yoga diet that a patient follows, or even the karma of a prior lifetime, we could say. In other words, we can almost always point the finger more or less directly at the individual in the case of individual illness. In the case of mass illness, however, we have to look to more common factors that could come into play. and thus to the environment at large. This environment emerges as the source of epidemic disease. Thick environments, according to the Vaidyas, these produce thick populations. So we've shifted where we're pointing our fingers and blaming the causes of disease. But when early Ayurvedic physicians are then asked to explain how environments get sick in the first place, they turn to the more natural kind of conclusion that you would expect from a person-based view of the world. And again, point the finger at the people and their karmic habits or yoga diets. The physicians frame this in a really interesting way. They say that it starts with rulers who have unclear minds and bad yoga diet. Such rulers spread their own disharmonious states like a contagion through a population. The population mirrors the ruler, and in this way, societies become filled with greedy, selfish, duplicitous, and unhappy people. Thick in understanding, their actions don't take stock of the balances and harmonious relations that are needed to promote and propagate their health at large. So they do things and they live in manners that are actively disruptive of the delicate balances that sustain surrounding ecologies. We can see them over farming or over hunting or over fishing. They pollute the waterways and they foul the air. They neglect caring for the vast networks of relations upon which their very lives depend. And when this kind of activity becomes compounded over generations, physicians say that such actions have come back to bite a population in its proverbial rear end when an epidemic rears its head, because the degraded environment now is transmitting its own imbalances to an unwitting population through the yoga diet that it must engage in order to live. To avoid such things, according to Ayurveda, we must cultivate a true understanding that fosters behaviors that are supportive of those broader unities of existence, which is to say the broader living unity of the Purusha, that is the world itself. Now, when I think about these things, and this is what I'm going to try and leave you with here, my mind inevitably turns towards the present. We have a recent pandemic. We have a widespread breakdown happening across nations around the world, the political norms. There's an increase in social discord, and there is this growing threat to the possibility of widespread war breaking out across the world. This is all set against the backdrop of an ongoing environmental catastrophe that will probably become the defining aspect of our age. And so with that in mind, I'd like to just close by leaving us with a question to ponder. And it's simple. The question is this: how might a person-based view of the world and a sense of ourselves as deeply embedded, indeed identical to the horizons of our worldly experience, how might such a view of the world and of ourselves serve us today? It's with that I will finish my talk, and thank you very much for your attention on this Saturday morning.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was fascinating.
Have I ended the sharing here?
So we would like to invite anybody who is present to and wants to make questions for Dr. Matthew to please raise their hands. Anna, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this very interesting talk. I'm wondering, and I don't know a lot about Ayurveda, but it seems that as a medical system, health would be the goal, the main goal of Ayurveda. And so I'm wondering, how does Ayurveda see itself in terms of this pursuit of health in relation to the pursuit of liberation? Is it that, could we say that in Ayurveda, health in a way could be understood as liberating, and therefore the more transcendent question about liberation I mean, it's not immediately a question within Ayurveda, or, I mean, are you reading Ayurveda as a philosophical system as well as a medical system, or as a medical system that can insert itself into other more transcendent considerations of liberation?
I like the way that you put that. Thank you for your question. Wonderful question. I think Ayurveda sees itself, at least the early Ayurvedic texts, they style themselves as sort of being the practical fruition of philosophical ideas. When we talk about the social realities of early Ayurveda, we're talking about wandering physicians primarily, those who were out in the world looking for new medicines, testing and experimenting with the broader sort of, the pantry of medical substances that we can find in the world. And in the course of their wanderings, they were continuously in contact with the broader Shramana populations of India, right? And so I imagine that there were, wonderful debates that must have taken place in forest grottos at some place during the rainy season or things like that, where physicians were talking in tandem with those who were searching for spiritual liberation. Now, as a result, we can say that it's clear to me, at least, that Ayurveda sees health as part of a continuum with spiritual liberation. Health, as we think of it, is just one step upon the pathway towards moksha. And there's no way to say that there is a shifting of gears that have to take place from the moment of attaining bodily health to the moment of pursuing moksha. Now, that said, the basic aim of Ayurvedic physicians is to secure those 100 years of life that a human being is supposed to have, according to the Purusharthas, right? But the point in allowing those 100 years to play out is because without those 100 years, it's very difficult for a human being to have the kinds of insights that lead towards liberation. Now, if you take this and see that they have a basic sort of orientation towards curing bodily disease and ensuring that we get our 100 years, we see that bodily disease requires navigating the environments that they are embedded in. And then we see that the kinds of insights that lead towards sustaining physical individual health are precisely the same kind of insights, as far as Ayurveda is concerned, that lead towards the attainment of moksha. It is a direct continuum. And the line between the kinds of yoga that I was describing earlier, the Sama yoga, Hatha yoga, all that kind of stuff, that plays directly into the yoga that leads towards what they say is the cessation of Vedanas. They use the cessation of sensations, essentially, right? Positive or negative reactivity to the world. That is the state of moksha. And so the Satya Buddhi is creating the conditions for that to be produced, okay? Did I get to every aspect of that? Okay, great. That was a wonderful question. Thank you, Anna.
Ranjana Yadav, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I was clear, sir. Hello.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you.
We're hearing you.
Okay. Very nice talk, sir. I'm Ranjana from India. Sir, I have one question. We find or we learn or see that Ayurveda focused on Purusharth, like dharma, artha, kam, moksha, all depend on life, good and healthy life, and that's why we talk about the hitamayu, sukhamayu, ahitamayu, asukhamayu, 4 kind of ayu talk about in we see in the Ayurveda. So for my question is, what is the important for Ayurveda? Is a social life, physical life, mental life, or we can say spiritual life? Your holistic approach.
Is the question which one is
what
more
is the center in? What is in the center of Ayurveda? Yeah, which one is in the center? Like in your mental life, or because we see in the Ayurveda is very much more focused on mind. Mind understanding, because mind influence your understanding influence your sensory organ influence your perception. So I think it's very much focus on mental health. That's why I give importance to Sankhya philosophy, yoga philosophy, and to connect mental health with your physical health, spiritual health. So so what is the main concern concern of yoga related to health?
Thank you for that question, Ranjana. That's a difficult one to answer, to be perfectly honest. When Ayurveda talks about its focus, the physicians in the Charaka Samhita, at least, they say our focus is exclusively on supporting the ayu of the Purusha, okay? And the Purusha is the center and the reason for all Ayurvedic practice. And because the Purusha contains within itself both the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, right? The Ayurvedic physicians don't really sort of elevate one over the other, at least in the claims that they make directly in the text. They take Purusha as the totality that requires an equal and balanced consideration of both bodies, minds, and spiritual pursuits. It is, these things hang together so tightly for the early Vaidyas in my mind as I read them. That there is, if your mind is unwell, then you don't need to just focus on the mind. You may also need to address what's happening within the body, because these things intersect and interact with each other. If your spiritual progress is stunted, then you need to look also at the way that the body is interacting with the mind and with our more spiritual endeavors. So it is a slightly difficult question to answer, but when I'm sympathetic to your perspective, I think, as well. When I read the foundational texts of Ayurveda, especially the Charaka Samhita, I see ultimately a focus on the cultivation of what seems to be the root, the foundations of health in the Charaka Samhita's understanding, and that is the ability to produce clear states of awareness or not. So that would lead towards your interpretation that you're suggesting that Ayurveda is more exclusively sort of rooted in mental understandings, right? So we can address karma through the mind, and through the clarification of the mind, we can produce future habits of karma that will lead towards spiritual endeavors. It's amazing, though, I'll say, how well Ayurveda balances out its consideration for all these different aspects of life and tries to give all of them equal weight. At no point, to give a sort of example of what I mean here, does Ayurveda say that the practice of dharma, as it's laid out in the Dharma Shastras, sort of like, is somehow not conducive to health. It folds everything that Indian culture at that moment in history was producing into its pursuit of medical perfection, right? And so I find it a difficult question to answer for that reason, because Ayurveda seems to be such a broadly embracive approach to the world and to ourselves in all of our different dimensions. I hope that gave you a kind of answer, but I know it was probably a frustrating one.
Vishal Belsar, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi. I have a question a bit tangential. Now, you've referred to Purusha and Prakriti.
Okay.
I'm a bit interested whether in your research, how did you find any intersections between Ayurveda and the tantric pursuits? Because you kind of come across ideas like Rasa Shastra, which is particularly, usage of potentially what would normally be called toxic compounds and so on. Is this intersection between Ayurveda and Tantra recorded anywhere? Like Tantra refers to Ayurveda, because when you're saying Purusha, Prakriti, and Self, that is a bit distinct from when we are saying, Shiva and Shakti, or the I would say the unfolding of the primordial element into the tattvas and the mahabhutas. Is this have you found this intersection similar, or there's a difference in the way Ayurveda or related, is the same? Is it undocumented, or in the literature, I'm saying? So when you're referring to something like Charaka Samhita or any other text.
Yes, okay, that's a wonderful question. Thank you for that, Vishal. I appreciate it. The foundational texts are where my expertise lie, right? So I focus primarily on the Charaka and the Sushruta Samhitas. Occasionally, I'll lead into the more medieval texts of the Ashtanga Hridayam and the like, right? Those are where we see much more pronounced tantric influence. But I can tell you there is a moment in the Charaka Samhita, it's the 5th chapter of the Sharirasthana, the section on the body. And this is that same section of text that contains that statement that I traced to the Upanishads and to the Mahabharata, where if one sees the self in the world and the world in the self, then right, that claim, very, very famous and widespread in its usage. That section of text right there has within it a really unique set of comparisons between what we find as internal to a Purusha and external to a Purusha. Or as we would put it in a more sort of modern language, what we would assign to Purusha as an embodied human being and Prakriti as the world outside. The language of this passage, to me, looks like it comes from a much later authority. There is an invocation of the Antaratmiki, which is a really strange sort of way of trying to reference the Antaratman. You wouldn't find it in a text that dates to the Charaka Samhita. And so that use of that term and a couple of other elements within that passage point to the fact that at some point, a redactor from the Charaka tradition found something that they saw within Tantra and said, this is it, this is perfect, okay? But it poses a kind of unique problem, actually. It almost lends itself towards a microcosmological interpretation of the human body. And this makes it something that fits kind of awkwardly within the broader patterns of a worldly Purusha that we see throughout the Charaka Samhita. So unfortunately, there is a sort of limited amount of tantric influence, and it seems to be, I wouldn't want to say uneasy, but a more sort of difficult to navigate interaction between these two traditions. That said, I think later Ayurvedic texts are much more skilled at dealing with tantric elements, and especially when we think about the alchemical side of Tantra, working its way into the production of medicines and the like, that would have to be sort of, there may be a kind of prehistory of Tantra working itself out through Ayurveda in the way that they talk about the development of various medicines, the weights and the measures and the apparatuses and the like. Unfortunately, I'm not the expert on that one, so I can't give you a deeper insight into that. But it is a fascinating question, Vishal. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Usha Gautama, please unmute yourself.
Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for that very, very interesting talk. So I'll just read out my question. And
Sure.
So philosophically, though the jiva, which is, I mean, I'm just talking from the perspective of the Charaka Samhita, that which could be understood as a self that maybe carries karmic valence in its temporally expansive journey, might essentially, I mean, be of the nature of the Paramatma or the Supreme Self, which is essentially an omnipresent self unshrouded by karma. However, given the very specific remedial focus of the Charaka Samhita, would it make better sense to draw a distinction between these two selves, though essentially philosophically they may be the same? The karmic self that suffers and the the transcendental self that does not. So, which is the knowing of which, as you said, is the cessation of all suffering.
Right. Yes. It's a beautiful question. Wonderful. And one that I wish I could have teased out the difference between a little bit more clearly in this. I live in Kentucky, so I spend a lot of time translating things to people who've never heard any of these terms whatsoever. So my language sometimes falls to a more common sort of level, I suppose. Yes, I think it is important to make this distinction, as you say, between the jiva as the karmically inflected and reincarnating self and this supreme self that is free of the influence of karma. But what I think I would add here is that there is a kind of, it doesn't produce a duality at the end, right? Yeah. It simply produces a reframed understanding of what this transmigrating self is really all about. Now, what I'd like to add to your framing there is that there's a really sort of robustly worked out theory of transmigration that takes place in the Charaka Samhita, which you may have encountered yourself. And they talk about the way that karma sticks to the mind as it transmigrates. The mind enters into a subtle state, and it's that subtle state that borrows the consciousness of the Atman that we call the jiva, essentially, right? As a result, when we're talking about the liberation of a jiva, what we're really talking about is the eradication of the influences of karma on the mind, not specifically on the self or the Purusha, right? Generally speaking. And I think that's the critical sort of difference here. What we're seeing here is not a separation or a sort of what would the word be here? a dissolving of one aspect of the self and the emergence of another, but rather the quelling of one aspect of oneself that has been functioning improperly all along. And when it comes to that quelled, tranquil sort of state, then it's functioning of being a modality by which the conscious self experiences the world. Then it comes to the fore as like a true possibility suddenly, right? And this is the kind of situation that could potentially lead towards the attainment of moksha. Did that get to your? We could argue about this. I think. Okay, great, wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you so much, Pusha.
Okay, I think we can end our meeting here today. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the fascinating talk, the great answers. It's a very interesting work that you have. Hope to see more of it in the future.
I hope to make more of it, yes, for you.
Yes. And so we end here. Thank you so much for everybody who came, who joined, who put their questions forth, and hope to keep in touch in the future.
I'll just say one quick thing. If anyone has trouble accessing anything of mine that they'd like to get a hold of, please email me directly. It's not a problem, okay? I know sometimes we run up against these paywalls and things, but I'd hate for people to not have access to the wild thoughts that I've been having. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity. It's been a wonderful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.